Security cameras at the Royal British Legion Club captured a seemingly harmless moment that would decide a man's fate. In the dim light of the bar, a 15-year-old boy quietly pulled out a long knife, hidden on his person. He said nothing, did not look around, just leaned towards his companion, Joe Ward, and secretly handed him the weapon. No one in the club that night realized what was happening, but a few minutes later, a scream tore through the air. A young man collapsed to the floor in a pool of blood, and the two who had just exchanged the deadly weapon disappeared from the scene. What could cause a normal gathering to end in tragedy? Why would a teenager carry a knife? And what really led Joe Ward to take the life of Eddie O'Rourke, a man with no criminal record, not affiliated with any gang? In this video, we follow the case step by step to understand what really happened inside a peaceful club in Runcorn. Eddie O'Rourke is an 18-year-old living in Runcorn, a small town in Cheshire, northwest England. To many in the local community, Eddie conjures up images of a quiet, reserved young man who tries to stay out of trouble. He attends the local school and is a regular at the Royal British Legion Club, a popular hangout for young people in the area on weekends. Eddie is not a standout. He is not too loud, not involved in gangs or problematic groups, but that is what makes him popular. His family, especially his mother, always describe Eddie as thoughtful, giving in, putting others before himself. His friends call him the guy you can count on if things get crazy. The Royal British Legion Club is a two-story building on a quiet street, surrounded by rows of terraced houses that have aged. On weekends, the place is often crowded with young locals who come to play pool, drink some light drinks, and chat. The atmosphere is intimate, with few conflicts. The older generation usually comes during the day, while the younger generation takes over in the evening. It is the kind of place where the older generation and the younger generation coexist without clashing. Also in this town, just a few blocks away from the club, Joe Ward, also 18, lives in the Lockfield area. Unlike Eddie, Joe does not leave a good impression on adults. Although he has no official criminal record, he has been called out in some minor conflicts between groups of young people. The way Joe dresses, his attitude, and the tense silence in his presence make some people feel wary. It is worth mentioning that Joe and Eddie once had something in common: a girl. She used to be Joe's girlfriend, but after they broke up, she started seeing Eddie. This love affair was not noisy, not public, but still enough to cause a simmering disturbance between the two. The glances in the club, the whispers from the people around, all created a layer of hidden, quiet, and uncomfortable atmosphere. No one in the neighborhood expected that on a weekend evening, a seemingly peaceful space like the Royal British Legion Club would become the scene of a crime that shocked the whole town. Before that happened, everything went on as usual: dim lights, loud laughter, and seemingly harmless conversations. But amidst that normalcy, there were small signs that were overlooked. A group of old acquaintances, a glance that lingered longer than necessary, an appearance at the wrong time, in the wrong place. That evening, the Royal British Legion Club had a larger crowd than usual. A group of local youth showed up early, taking up a few tables near the bar. The atmosphere was as usual, lively, but not too chaotic. Of those present, 3 names would be mentioned most often: Eddie O'Rourke, Joe Ward, and a 15-year-old boy. Eddie arrived shortly after rush hour. He was wearing his usual denim jacket, and he walked in with a few friends. No one seemed nervous or on guard. Everything, at least on the surface, was proceeding as if it were a normal night. In another corner, Joe Ward was also present. With him was the other boy, the one who would later be identified as the one who delivered the weapon. The two of them didn't drink much, and they weren't loud, but Joe's eyes kept scanning the crowd. Whenever his gaze stopped on Eddie, it had an unreadable nuance. There was something unspoken between Joe and Eddie. The old relationship, once broken, now replaced by someone else. Joe's old lover was now with Eddie. The transition had no arguments, no open conflict, but for Joe, it was not something that was easy to ignore. In the past few weeks, some acquaintances had heard Joe show signs of discomfort, not in harsh words but in passing, sometimes meaningful sentences. No one dared to affirm that Joe had any intention of doing anything, but the discomfort was real, and that night it smoldered in every gesture, every look. Sitting in the area near the hallway leading outside, Joe and the teenager occasionally exchanged whispers. No one heard the content, but that time, according to the surveillance camera and later accounts, was when the teenager pulled a long knife from his body, quietly handing it to Joe under the table. No one noticed. There was no loud noise, no behavior that crossed the line. The three continued to sit in the same space without touching. But the distance between their eyes, the silence between their words, seemed to be pulling an invisible string. Eddie still showed no signs of anxiety. He chatted with his friends, occasionally chuckled, and occasionally walked around the bar area. It was unclear whether he knew Joe was nearby or whether he was trying to avoid it. But what was certain was that no direct conflict had occurred up to that point. There was just one strange thing. A waiter later said that the atmosphere in the club that night was strangely tense. For whatever reason, many people felt like they were waiting for something to happen. A nameless feeling, but enough to make some people choose to leave early. And in that seemingly normal moment, everything was in place. People, eyes, objects in hand. One small step more, and the stretched string would break. The atmosphere in the club was still the same. Soft music was playing from the old speaker system. Beer was pouring steadily at the bar. A few people were gathered near the pool table. Others were standing chatting by the window looking out at the dark street outside. But in that crowd, three people, Eddie, Joe, and the 15-year-old boy, were approaching a point of no return. No one knew when Joe had picked up the knife. There was no big action, no shouting, no obvious warning signs. Everything happened in an unnatural silence, a silence that only those who had witnessed it could feel. The distance between Eddie and Joe gradually narrowed. There was no open provocation, no words exchanged. Maybe a look, maybe an ill-timed glance. But for Joe, that was enough to push him to the limit. At the moment of the incident, many people in the club were still turning their backs. No one expected such a sudden attack. Joe stepped forward quickly, his right hand hidden at his side. In a nearly silent motion, he pulled out the knife and stabbed Eddie straight into his abdomen. The blow was short but precise. The tip of the knife penetrated the jacket, cut through the soft tissue, and penetrated deep into the abdominal cavity. Eddie had no time to react. His body contracted, then he fell to the floor. The only sound was the heavy impact as he hit the ground. A person standing nearby screamed first, then panicked screams spread throughout the room. Some ran outside, some stood still. Someone rushed to help Eddie, but blood had already begun to seep through the fabric of his shirt, spreading across the old tile floor. Life was draining away in silence, in a daze that had not yet recognized what had happened. Joe stood there for a few seconds, still holding the knife. His eyes were empty. No one saw what he said. No regret, no fear. Then he turned around and walked quickly towards the door. The teenager who was with him also followed quietly. No one dared to stop him. No one had time to understand what had just happened. The knife used in the crime was later described as about 30 centimeters long, with a sharp blade and a black plastic handle, not the kind of knife used in a regular kitchen. It was brought along, not by accident, and it was used decisively, without hesitation. Some witnesses said that Eddie tried to sit up after the stab, but failed. Blood was coming out too quickly. His breathing was getting weaker. The person next to him tried to keep him awake, asking his name, holding his hands. But Eddie's eyes were starting to wander, his voice fading in chaos. The scene in the club at that time became chaotic, an incident that only lasted a few seconds, but left the feeling that time had stopped. The silence was torn apart, normalcy was falling apart, and a life was slipping away from everyone's hands without anyone having time to intervene. Joe and the other boy left the scene unchallenged. No one had the courage. No one knew what would happen next. Weapons in hand, blood on shirt, and a heavy silence. Eddie lay on the floor, surrounded by people he had known. No last words, no chance to defend himself. As soon as Eddie collapsed, a wave of panic spread through the Royal British Legion Club. No one believed what had just happened. Among those closest to the scene, someone immediately pulled out a phone, shaking his hand, and dialed 999. His voice was choked by screams and cries. The call to the police was recorded less than a minute after Eddie was stabbed. The caller tried to stay calm, reporting that a young man had been stabbed, was losing blood rapidly, and that the perpetrator had left the scene. He did not know if the victim was still alive or not, only that he was bleeding profusely and needed immediate medical attention. Many people in the club backed away. Some stepped outside to breathe. The previously cozy atmosphere was now replaced by an eerie coldness. Those who knew Eddie shouted his name, trying to keep him awake, but Eddie's eyes were already dim, and when the ambulance sirens sounded in the distance, the race for life officially began. Less than 5 minutes after the call was made, 2 police cars and an ambulance rushed to the Royal British Legion Club. It was an emergency response, a serious one, as reports from the scene suggested someone had been stabbed and was in critical condition. The long wail of sirens echoed through the quiet residential area, causing people to gather around, and the headlights shining directly on the club's facade seemed to tear the night air apart. The paramedics were the first to arrive and were quickly led to the tiled floor where Eddie O'Rourke lay. He was still breathing, but weakly. His heart rate was slowing. His shirt was stained red, and blood was seeping into the cracks in the tiles under the floor. A paramedic knelt down to check the wound. It was a deep stab wound in the lower left abdomen, an extremely dangerous location that could damage many internal organs. Immediately, the medical team began to stop the bleeding on the spot. They administered oxygen, attached a heart monitor, and called for backup. Meanwhile, a police officer stood in the middle of the scene, telling people to keep their distance. Some were still crying. Others watched silently, not daring to speak. The scene had been temporarily marked with caution tape, and no one was allowed to enter or leave freely. The police quickly questioned everyone present, who had witnessed it, who had seen the perpetrator, who knew the name of the boy who was with him. Some said Joe Ward. Others simply said, "He had a knife, and then he walked away." No one was sure, but everyone knew something big had happened. In the ambulance, Eddie was lying on his side, his head turned to the side to avoid choking on blood. One officer pressed his hand against his stomach almost constantly, while another held the oxygen mask in place. They knew they were in a race against time. The ambulance left the club less than 8 minutes after arriving. The direction was Halton General Hospital, the nearest facility that could handle a stab wound. But despite their best efforts, Eddie did not survive. He was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. The wound was too deep, the blood loss was too much, and the damage was irreversible. The police were notified by the hospital about 30 minutes after leaving the scene. They had gone from a serious assault to a murder. The situation changed immediately. What had been a case of evidence collection had become a high-level investigation. News of Eddie's death spread quickly throughout Runcorn. Police reconstructed the scene overnight and expanded the search area. The identities of Joe Ward and the teenager accompanying him began to be established through witness accounts and CCTV footage. The scene was quieter now, but it was no longer a club. It became a tragic marker, where just hours before there had been laughter, and now it was the beginning of a months-long investigation. And as the morning began, the police knew that the next important thing was to examine the crime scene and the body thoroughly, so that no detail, no matter how small, was overlooked. Immediately after receiving confirmation of the victim's death at the hospital, the Cheshire Police Forensic Investigation Team immediately arrived at the Royal British Legion Club to conduct an examination of the scene. This was no longer a fight. From that point on, the entire process was upgraded to a murder investigation. The scene was left untouched. The area where Eddie O'Rourke collapsed was still marked. A large layer of blood had soaked into the grey tiled floor, spreading out in a crescent shape. Along the bloodstain were smaller streaks, possibly from the hands or body of the person who had tried to support him in his final moments. Each drop of blood was marked, photographed and collected for DNA analysis, although the identity of the victim was no longer in doubt. The chair Eddie had sat in before the attack was still there. A half-drunk glass of water was left on the table. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken objects. This further reinforces the idea that the stabbing happened suddenly, with no time for the victim to react or defend himself. Forensics then collected blood samples, scanned fingerprints on nearby surfaces, and examined the entire camera system in the club. All images, sounds, and movements were extracted to serve the investigation. They also searched for traces of the murder weapon, but did not find the murder knife at the scene, indicating that the perpetrator had taken it away after the act. As for the autopsy, Eddie's body was transferred to the Halton Regional Forensic Center. Here, a senior forensic doctor conducted a thorough examination to determine the exact cause of death. The initial conclusion recorded in the forensic report was as follows. Eddie suffered a single stab wound to the lower left abdomen. The blade penetrated 8 to 10 centimeters deep, penetrating the abdominal wall, damaging the artery and major internal organs, leading to acute blood loss and circulatory failure. There were no signs of secondary injuries, which confirmed that the victim did not fight back or fight before being stabbed. The blade was simulated through witness accounts and crime scene photos. About 30 centimeters long, sharp, possibly a large kitchen knife or a specialized knife brought with purpose. The wound was not skewed, indicating a strong stab force and clear initiative. There were no tears on the victim's clothes outside the stabbed area. This further strengthens the hypothesis that the incident happened very quickly, almost in an instant. There were no self-defense items, no signs of struggle. The victim's body was completely passive when attacked. After completing the examination, the forensic agency concluded that the cause of death was a fatal stab wound causing severe blood loss and damage to internal organs. This is an important legal factor because it clearly establishes that the act of causing death was direct and immediate, not an accident or unintentional. With the above facts, the police had the first piece of the puzzle to reconstruct the entire case. But to track down the culprit, they needed more: witnesses, cameras, and traces. Once the crime scene had been sealed off and initial forensic evidence had been collected, the Cheshire Police Crime Investigation Team began their investigation. The first focus was clear: to identify the man who had attacked Eddie O'Rourke with a knife, as well as anyone else who had assisted. The officers split into small teams, taking direct statements from people who had been at the Royal British Legion Club on the night of the murder. Many were still in a state of shock, but some witnesses had clear memories of what they had seen. Many of these statements matched, describing a young man in a dark shirt, aged around 18, who had had a secret feud with Eddie and who had looked at the victim with hostility before the incident. Not long after, a name began to appear repeatedly: Joe Ward. The police immediately checked the CCTV system inside the club. Although the club was dimly lit and many areas were obscured, at least 2 cameras captured a teenager wearing a hoodie handing something to Joe Ward under a table. In the next recording, Joe pulled a long, sharp object out of his body and walked towards Eddie. Based on that, the investigation team determined that there were 2 people directly involved: the attacker and the person who provided the weapon. The 15-year-old was identified through a witness account, an acquaintance who lived in the same residential area as Joe. He was detained just a few days after the incident, while he was at home with his family. During initial questioning, the teenager appeared nervous but cooperative. He admitted to carrying the knife and admitted to giving it to Joe in the club. When asked why, he said he was just doing what was asked of him and didn't think Joe would actually use it. This testimony, combined with the camera footage, was enough to confirm the elements of the crime: aiding and abetting murder. From the teenager's testimony, the police tracked down Joe Ward's exact whereabouts. He had not fled the area, but he had not been home for the first few days. Through phone tracking and social media activity, the police tracked him to an abandoned house near Lockfield, a place Joe had visited in the past. From there, the investigation team officially filed a case and submitted it to the judicial authorities to request an arrest warrant for Joe Ward, who was identified as the prime suspect with full motive, opportunity, and means to commit the crime. On the 3rd night after the incident, the full case file was sent to the prosecutor. The arrest warrant was in the process of being completed, and while everyone was still in shock over Eddie's loss, the police knew that the next phase of the case would be decisive: action. After the official arrest warrant was approved, the police quickly launched their plan of action. The first target was Joe Ward, the prime suspect in the Eddie O'Rourke murder case. Data from his phone and social media showed that Joe had not left the Runcorn area, but had temporarily hidden in an abandoned house near Lockfield, where he had previously been. The arrest took place early on the morning of the 4th day after the incident. A plainclothes task force approached the house in silence. Joe Ward was arrested while alone, showing no signs of resistance. He remained cool, did not resist, and remained almost silent throughout the process of being escorted to the police station. This did not surprise anyone, because throughout the case, Joe had always shown an unpredictable indifference, as if everything no longer concerned him. At the same time, the 15-year-old boy, who was identified as the person who gave Joe the knife in the club, was also detained according to the procedure for minors. The arrest was made at his home, in the presence of his legal guardian and legal representative. The entire procedure was carried out in accordance with regulations, without any reaction or opposition from the family. Both suspects were quickly taken to Cheshire Police Station for further proceedings. Although there was no reckless behavior or evasion, their presence at the investigation headquarters officially closed the search phase and opened the door to directly facing the legal consequences. At Cheshire Police Station, Joe Ward was questioned in a private room under the supervision of the lead investigator and his defense lawyer. During the first session, Joe remained silent. His eyes were cold, his face expressionless. No panic, no confusion, just waiting. It was not until the second session, when he was shown a part of the video footage extracted from the camera in the Royal British Legion Club, that Joe began to speak. No long-windedness, no denial. His answer was short. "I stabbed him." There was no sign of resistance or evasion. However, what interested the investigation team most was the motive. Why did Joe carry a knife? Why did he do it in public, in front of so many people? Joe said that he had dated Eddie's girlfriend in the past. That relationship ended badly. After the breakup, Joe tried many times to get back together, but failed. When he learned that Eddie was seeing that girl, he felt insulted. "I felt replaced. I felt worthless," he said. According to his testimony, Joe did not plan to kill anyone, but when he saw Eddie at the club that night, his anger flared. He said, "I didn't mean to stab him to death, but I wanted him to know that I was still there." Although he did not say it explicitly, the investigator's tone and expression clearly showed that his hatred was spontaneous, but had accumulated in the past. Joe admitted that he had intentionally accepted the knife from the teenager who was with him, as recorded by the camera. He did not deny this action, nor did he try to blame others. The entire testimony was recorded and fully transcribed. There were no major contradictions between the testimony and the evidence collected earlier. This helped the investigation team strengthen the case and guide the prosecution strategy later. As for the 15-year-old, he was also interviewed in a private room with adult supervision and legal representation. He confirmed that he had carried the knife with him throughout the evening and that he had given it to Joe when asked. He did not deny the action, but repeatedly emphasized that he did not think Joe would actually use it. The police still recorded the statement, but also affirmed that the indirect support role was clear. After completing the entire process of taking statements, the police had in hand a unified chain of facts: behavior, motive, means, consequences. All closed, clear, and ready to move to the next stage. After completing the interrogations, the investigation team moved on to the stage of consolidating the case file. The goal was to ensure that all elements of evidence, from testimony to physical evidence, were consistent, complete, and had clear legal value when presented in court. The murder knife, which Joe Ward had carried away from the scene, was eventually seized during a search of a related location near Lockfield. The knife was about 30 centimeters long, had a sharp blade, and a black plastic handle, completely consistent with the description from forensics and the images from the club's security camera. There were traces of blood on the blade, which were later confirmed to match the DNA of the victim, Eddie O'Rourke. In addition, direct witnesses at the scene played an irreplaceable role. Some people present at the time of the incident provided clear statements, consistent with the events extracted from the security camera. They witnessed Joe Ward pull out a knife, move towards Eddie, and act in just a few seconds. These accounts, along with the visual data and statements from the suspect, helped to paint a coherent picture of the incident, leaving no room for doubt. With sufficient physical, visual, witness, and oral evidence, the police determined that there was no need to reconstruct the scene. The case had enough elements to move to the final step: prosecution and trial in court. The Eddie O'Rourke trial was held at Crown Court, presided over by a senior judge and a jury. The atmosphere in the courtroom was quiet and solemn. The victim's family was present, sitting quietly behind the public benches. Both defendants, Joe Ward and the 15-year-old boy, were tried at the same time, but on two different charges. After many days of debate between the prosecution and the defense, the jury reached a final conclusion. Joe Ward was convicted of murder, intentional murder. The basis was established from carrying a knife, actively approaching the victim, and the single but fatal stab that led to Eddie's death. Joe's own testimony in the interrogation room further reinforced the element of intention in the act. As for the 15-year-old boy, the court acknowledged that he did not directly cause the death but had a supporting role. Carrying a knife in public and then giving it to Joe just before the incident was considered an act that contributed to serious consequences. He was convicted of manslaughter. Although the sentence was not as severe as Joe's, it still reflected clear criminal responsibility. When the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the courtroom became solemn. Eddie's family, especially his mother, shed tears. She did not speak, only tightly holding the hands of her loved ones. Many people present in the court shared that they felt the loss clearly in every look, every held breath. The judge concluded the trial with a cold but decisive message. A life was taken because of jealousy and lack of control. This is the price for a wrong decision that cannot be reversed. As the defendants were escorted out of the court, public opinion began to ask a bigger question. How can tragedies like this not be repeated in society? The death of Eddie O'Rourke has left a gaping hole in the Runcorn community. News of the case spread across the town within hours of being reported in the local paper. Locals were left in shock. Several people who had seen Eddie at the club on the night of the murder spoke of their shock at his death. No one expected a young man with no links to gangs or crime to be the victim of such a serious murder. The case has sparked outrage and concern in the community, particularly among parents of teenage children. Following the trial, a community campaign called Live Your Life, Drop the Knife was launched, urging young people to stop carrying knives as a form of protection. Many local schools and youth organizations have joined the campaign in an effort to prevent the rise in knife violence. Cheshire Police also spoke out strongly. A spokesman warned, "A knife in your pocket does not make you safer, it makes you part of a tragedy." That statement became a central message at many of the talks and conferences that followed. Although the case has been closed in the courtroom, the aftershocks it has left on society are still lingering. And while the community tries to heal, the larger question remains: what lessons should be learned from the death of a young man? Eddie O'Rourke's death was not a gang fight. It did not happen in the dark alleys of crime. Instead, it happened on a normal evening, in a familiar space with young people who seemed to be simply enjoying their free time. But a small conflict, related only to love, was blown up, kept, accumulated, and then turned into an irreversible tragedy. Eddie's death is a clear reminder that just a wrong decision in a few seconds, an uncontrolled emotion, and a knife in hand can result in death and years of brokenness. Teenage love is fragile, but when it is driven by hatred, it is no longer an emotion. It becomes the engine of tragedy. We need to ask, what could have prevented this case? A timely intervention? A conversation earlier between friends, between parents and children, or simply not carrying a weapon? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story to be thought-provoking, please share it. Subscribe to our channel to continue our journey of telling real-life cases from a kind and objective perspective.